Hello, welcome back, everybody, to another year of the Sunday Podcast.
I'm Ollie Lam.
And I'm Matt Seddon.
Back in 2025 for our 5th season. You can expect more of this.
He's claiming that he was ill before the semi-final, whatever, but, you know, I just feel like at that point he was just looking for attention.
And some of this.
And you normally say, no human is limited. So I can't limit myself, or I can't just say I can do.
As well as event coverage around all the major races on the UK circuit.
And if you're a fan of the pod, please give us a rating and review on your preferred podcast streaming service.
And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, give us a follow on Instagram at Sunday Podcast.
As always, thanks for listening. See you next time. And we hope you enjoyed the episode.
Hey guys, welcome back. Brought to you by Sports Shoes. As always, Nathan Gillis on the pod today from Olympic Sports Scholarship. So if you listen to the George Cootie pod, George obviously thanked Nathan a lot for his move over to the States and his transfer as well. So Nathan's been involved in a lot of, I guess, UK recruits going out to the US on those scholarships to the NCAA, and he's super knowledgeable about it. So we sat down with him and basically broke down the process, didn't we, mate?
Broke down the process, but I think more importantly for me was the change of landscape within the NCAA, how nil deals are impacting recruitment, how roster limits are impacting recruitment. And actually, if you're an athlete or even a coach who has an athlete and you're thinking about going to the NCAA, Nathan does a really good job at forecasting potentially the next 3, 4, 5 years might look like, as well as kind of, assist in decision making and who the NCAA is for and what athletes kind of succeed out there versus what don't. So yeah, it was a long overdue podcast. He is a great guy. He's super good at breaking it all down as well and discussing that process, like you said, and very, very passionate, I think, coming from the NCAA himself about the job he's in and the career he's basically founded. So long overdue guest, but a very good episode nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, enjoy this one. Quite, I guess, a bit different for us. But look, if you're into running, if you're into the US scene and the collegiate aspect, or for sure, if you're actually thinking about heading out there as an athlete or like Matt says, as a coach, this is definitely a great episode to listen to. So it's not just for your kind of potential collegiate recruits. Like if you're interested in how contracts work, how the NCAA works, if you're interested in money in the sport, then it's huge as well. Because look, at the moment, the athletes who are out there, they're getting paid a lot more in line with what I guess Matt and I'm sure you guys listening think your kind of professional athletes should be getting paid, really, particularly British-based athletes who historically there's not a lot of money around.
And in a lot of cases more. But yeah, that was literally the point I was going to make it. This is for people who aren't just thinking about going to America, but just have an invested interest in our sport and kind of how the contracts and how that side, the money side, works. Because, yeah, brands, the money they're putting into it is scary, and the money schools actually have as well is also quite frightening. Talks about potentially the NCAA just turning into what we see as just like a professional model, because that clock, that age limit in the NCAA is going to be no more, he thinks in a few years, which is going to open the door up even wider to, a load of international athletes and a load of athletes who are good enough to be professionals. And this is why the standard in the NCAA is so high as well, because you are getting people stay on longer than you ever have within the NCAA system. So great episode. And yeah, we'll let you enjoy. And Lum, we'll be back. Happy weekend, everyone. Happy Sunday, British Champs final day. So yeah, I mean, any quick last minute predictions for British Champs?
Put me in the spot now, mate. Georgia Bell to win the 1500. There you go. There's my prediction. So
safe and sound, mate. Yeah, fair play. And we will catch you all with a review of British Champs, but also National Cross, of course, and a preview to what's coming up, because it will be those European indoors literally the following week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for listening as always, and we'll catch you very, very soon. Right, Nathan, great to have you on. Welcome to the podcast. Just how are you, first of all, mate?
Very good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, good. Great to have you. Like, we've been, obviously, I think it was, I guess, the George Cootie pod that brought it on, but we've kind of spoken for a while about potentially getting you on just to chat about the great stuff you do with getting people over to the US. So should we start there, mate? Just about how you started, I guess even wanting to do it in the first place, wanting to help people get out to the US on running scholarships.
Yeah, so I guess it began when I went
back in 2014, 2015. So I was it was common when I went. Now, I actually looked at this quite recently because the year. So I was an okay athlete. I was sort of okay at cross, okay at the 800, and I looked. And I was the only lad actually that came top 10 at intercounties that went to the US that year, 2014. So I kind of went, I guess, during an era where it was still common. Don't get me wrong, but a little bit less common. So I had 5 years where I got a tremendous amount from it. I unquestionably made a lot of mistakes. I think probably the first mistake I made was just understanding the landscape of the NCAA. I think my view was kind of bulk spam, email everywhere and get offers. And I think the range of quality over there is quite a bit more than the UK, athletically, academically, all sorts. So I think probably that from the get-go in terms of setting this up, just being a little bit more, I guess, pragmatic, a little bit more honest with the with the realities of the NCAA, and just being a little bit more athlete-focused, I guess, in terms of advice and kind of trying to help these kids make very good decisions with where they go. Because I think the US can be phenomenally advantageous from an upside perspective. It can be quite, I don't want to say dangerous, but you do see a lot of kids that go over there that just don't make the progression they should do. So I think just a little bit more, athlete focus was probably the aim. And that's kind of where, when we launched, it was, the goal was to be the best from a service provision perspective, not the biggest. Because I don't think this is something you can do well at volume. This is a more complicated process than probably a lot of people will give it credit for. So that was the goal in terms of setting this up. And to be honest, I love it. It's incredibly fulfilling to see kids go over and, like George's and, that kind of generation of talent that's gone over, to see them make just quite frankly transformative steps as athletes, but as young men and women. I think George, again, this is going to be a great example of that, because he was a proper little fit when he was 17 years old. So, he's grown up and he's a mature lad, and, he's a more well-rounded individual now than he was when he went. And it's the same for me. It's been, I think, the same for the vast majority of lads that go over, to be honest, and young women. So, that's a big part of it, because don't get me wrong, the social life has been pretty non-existent for the last year. So it's a good job. I have enjoyed it. Time difference is definitely real.
Yeah, even arranging this podcast, you made us aware that you could do as late as bloody midnight, because that's when your calls finish up stateside. But yeah, so Olympic sports scholarships. Have you been going a year then? For some reason, I thought you'd been going longer than that.
Yeah, so when I returned home, so I did a year in Cardiff. You probably remember, Ollie, me popping with a knackered calf, and that's when I knew that the gig was up. So I got recruited basically at a company in Europe that did this, and I was like their first kind of, I guess, exploring track and field. They were kind of, most of the companies that work within this industry are sort of soccer based, the bigger sports, and then they kind of delve into track. So I did it I've been doing this since 2021, since the sort of COVID year. So I operated within that kind of umbrella, that industry, with that company for sort of 2-3 years. And then, I guess sort of had differing opinions with how I felt this should be done. I don't have any qualms with what they wanted. I think kind of their approach was volume, and, obviously if you work with more kids, it's more efficient from a business model perspective. And they kind of wanted me to move into sort of a sales role and have a team that would do the placement. I always felt like my skill set was placement, advising kids, identifying the right programs based on their distances, their physiology, being involved in the actual service itself. That was kind of where I got a lot more enjoyment from. So switched over and set up Olympic sports. And obviously the benefit with the network is huge. The coaches will work with whoever they think is going to be helping them from a providing talent perspective. So I've been doing it a little bit longer. I helped lads when I was in the US, to be honest, as well, just even if it's just mates that were reaching out and be like, how do you go about it? Trying to put them in contact with some coaches. So I kind of got the premise, I guess, in terms of what coaches need, GPAs, academic profile, when you've ran times, making sure that you come across correctly, how you communicate with coaches is a little bit different with Americans than it is within the UK. They're being called sir, that type of stuff. So, I kind of got it, but there's no question now, the amount I've learned from when I began. Of course, like anything in life, right? The more time you do something for, the better your skill set becomes. So doing it. The company's a year old, but from a industry perspective, been doing it a little bit longer.
Yeah,
One thing I want to ask you, mate, is you mentioned when you went out and did it, it wasn't that common. And it really wasn't. You saw kind of, I guess, the elite of the elite in the UK perhaps might go out and get a scholarship, and it tended to be focused around a few big schools. And then there was a real influx in people going to, I guess, your smaller schools, even if they were technically D1, right? But what help did you have going out there yourself, like if any, when you did it?
I just completely chanced it. I was like, you know what, let's see what we can get done with this. So I got contacted by a guy called Darren Gorson, who's the head coach at New Mexico. So he's moved around a few. He's been at 3 or 4 different schools now since he recruited me as the head coach. But he dropped me a Facebook message. When I was a kid, I kind of wanted to go to the US. If I asked myself when I was 17 years old why, I would have struggled to give a straight answer. The allure of it was very appealing to me. I don't really know why, but I wanted to go. Kind of dabbled my hand at contacting coaches on email. Didn't really get too far, mainly because the email that I was sending off at that point, now I know, was pretty damn dreadful. It's nothing in terms of the way of information they were needed. So got a Facebook message and went, you know what, what's the worst that can happen? I'll just go full steam ahead. So I got contacted by recruitment companies when I was a kid. Never really particularly interested. I kind of had the opinion, I can do this myself, it's not going to be a problem. And I did. It worked. So, I got over. I think where I probably failed myself a little bit was I had good cross. So I ran pretty well at inter-counties. My 800 time was okay, 152, which, I hate saying this, right? Because I sound like a proper old man. But in today's money with carbon spikes, it's probably a 150, So in that era, I was probably a little bit more of an attractive recruit than I gave myself credit for. So I just signed too early. And the opportunities I could have got later in the year, I could have got probably quite a bit more bang for my buck. So the second program I was transferred and moved. That second program was the right fit. I should have gone there immediately. So that was probably my mistake. But I think that the change is more people are doing it. So you do get an element where people kind of follow suit. The money's better. There is more scholarship availability. And track and field, I think if you look in the US now, even, for example, the middle distances, they're doing phenomenally well. Actually, 10 years ago, not particularly. So I think there's been a change of perspective to the US. I think before it's kind of viewed as this will not work for the vast majority, whereas now it's actually probably gone the complete opposite way. People think it's going to work a lot. You kind of use Josh Kerr's, etc., as an example. And it's like, well, yeah, the truth's in the middle. It's not really changed that much from a decade ago. You need to go to the right people. Like with anything in life, the people kind of set the program. They set the agenda in terms of training, these sorts of things. But I think the perspective has changed from over a decade ago.
That's a great breakdown. Let's move on to the process. You've touched on it then about yourself when you went out there. But I think there's 2 processes particularly as well. The undergrad process and the opportunities an undergrad might have, the postgrad, which is becoming more and more common. And we are seeing older and older athletes go to the NCAA. So there's going to be a lot of questions around this. But what are the key differences between undergrad and postgrad going to the NCAA, those initial conversations that you're having and clients that you're working with?
So I'd say the biggest difference, and the best metaphor I can do for this, are you familiar with football?
Absolutely.
Okay, Chris Wood. I'd say a graduate student is the Chris Wood special. It's a January last minute transfer, right? It's like we need a banger and we need someone that can fill the spot in the roster. So for graduate students, you have to be fit. There's no question. You can run phenomenally well 22, 23, for example. But if your performance standards the year before you're heading to the US or before you finish your undergrad degree is quite poor, that's your value. So I think the major difference between an undergrad is there's value in youth. It's more about how good are you at some window before your US entrance. And because you're there for 5 years, that's how long you have in terms of from an eligibility perspective. A coach is willing to invest in that. If you're a graduate student, you're only there for a year or 2. You really need to be going in as an immediate fixer as such. You need to be instant quality. So I'd say for an undergrad, actually, probably the big difference from a process end, it takes a little bit longer. And just paperwork, etc. The eligibility process with the NCAA is a little bit more in depth. They're going to assess your GCSEs. Good timing. My drawer just collapsed. I'm sure you can cut that. That's me kicking
we'll
it.
Leave that in.
Where was I at? What's the eligibility, wasn't it?
Yeah, the undergrad process is a little bit more time consuming.
Yeah, and there's more risk. There is more risk. I think for a coach, you want to have a bit more of an assessment because you're dealing with young kids. You want to understand, is this even the right fit for the kid? Our program, do they want to do this for the right reasons? What they want to study, is it something which is actually going to suit us? Are there expectations in terms of what degree they want to do? Is it available within the program? Is it to the level that they want? So what normally a coach is trying to assess is like, is this kid actually going to come here and realistically stay for 4 or 5 years? Because it's high turnover. There's no question. you do get a lot of kids that go that drop out. So that process of just feeling comfortable before you make a formal offer is a little bit longer. I think for graduate students, and I've found this even from the athletes that reach out, it's more like, okay, I don't want to work yet. I'm running pretty well, but I'm not quite good enough to get any decent pro deal, or, you know, I just want the experience. So it's not really a risk for a coach. It's 1 or 2 years of money. There's more of the kind of, I say, strict athletic factors that come into that equation in terms of why they want to go. They want to run quick. They want to get the funding. You know, they want the experience. So it's less of a risk for a coach. So I normally say for graduate students, you know, if you're going into your final year of uni at home in good condition, you know, you're racing well, you're healthy, you've probably got a decent chance of getting some decent opportunities, and you can maybe go through that process for 4 or 5 months, quite frankly. You can do it pretty quickly. In undergrad kid, 18 months. You need to form that relationship with a coach and build it over a slightly longer window, just to kind of mitigate any risk that they could perceive.
Wow, it's a long time prior to going.
Yeah. Sure. You know,
and one thing sorry, mate, you go on. What were you going to say?
And paperwork, right? Because for an undergrad kid as well, like, yeah, I noticed this, an 18-year-old, 17, 18-year-old compared to a 21-year-old, there's a huge difference in maturity. You know, your ability to do paperwork quickly, kind of get things, because you've already gone through an admissions process to a university. A lot of the paperwork is less confusing. So that is an element of it as well. It's just things take a little bit longer for a kid, to be honest. I get their head around. And also a 17, 18-year-old, I mean, one of the big questions I always ask any kid that reaches out, like, should you do this? Do you want to study something which is going to be convertible back from the US? What are your athletic aims here? You know, what do you want to try and get out of the sport? Is this something where you're content going into a highly professional system where the expectations are going to be quite significant? You know, so I think even just from forget the process and just answering the fundamental question of should you do this or not, it's a much bigger question for a kid to answer than probably a 21-year-old. You know, because I think at 21, you're a bit more assured of yourself. You've probably gone through 3 years of being at university and you get the US a little bit more anyway. And the risk is lower. If you go over and run pretty well and your master's program isn't exactly what you wanted, you've already got a good undergrad degree from home. Obviously, if you go to the US and you waste 4 years and you get a degree that isn't going to even be convertible back home, you for example, you want to be an engineer and you go to a university where it's not even going to be recognized as a chartered qualification when you return. That's 4 years of your life that's not giving you any foundation in terms of coming home and beginning to work. So I think it's even just the risk assessment from a should you do it perspective, which is an important question.
One thing I was going to ask, and I think probably now is a good time because I'm sure some people listening will have this question, but it's also a question you might not be able to answer as well, but I'll go anyway. Just in terms of times, because I think that's what people want to know, right? If you are an undergrad guy, undergrad girl versus a postgrad guy, postgrad girl in, say, the 1500 or 5K, what is like your minimum operating standard for someone to basically work with you and then try and attain these sorts of scholarships? If you can,
we'll try and answer it. Why not? So 2 things. Before even assessing times, you got to have a good enough GPA. If your GPA grade point average is poor, you're a significantly more expensive investment for a coach. Any coach is going to want to recruit a kid with a decent academic scholarship because it makes it cheaper. You know, if you're getting 30, 40% academic aid, you're 60% to invest to get to a full or to a good number. If you're getting nothing academically, you're a more expensive investment. So one of the challenges with just a strict assessment of, you need to run these times, it kind of neglects how the finances work, which is obviously a big factor of this. But if I said D1 from a 15 end, I'd say for an undergrad lad to be in a position where you're realistically going to get invested low 350s, undergrad, probably doubling up with a decent 3K so you can show some aerobic capability, like you can do a job over cross if you need to in the future. For an undergrad lad, you got to be sub 348, sub 347. I mean, you need to be someone that's going to be immediately a banger in their conference. And you probably need to double that with a good 5K. I'd always say for any undergrad, for any graduate athlete, if you can do a good 5K, you're getting more money because you're dipping into the cross cash. And obviously that's a bigger pot for a lot of these programs. The cross money is just bigger than the track cash. And they also try and save that track money for sprinters and field event athletes. So even if you're a good 8:15 guy, you need to have some at least capability of women's end, sub 4:35 in the 15, which I think some people might be surprised by. We get full scholarships quite often for girls that are running sub 440. There's more money on the female side with Title IX regulations, which is where the US government mandated that institutions give the same number of opportunities to women as men, because you have American football money, which is just enormous. They have to equalize that by either cutting back a little bit of men's money in the other sports or by bumping up the women's money, and they normally do both. So You just don't have to run as quick, to be honest, to be in a decent position on the female side. But for a graduate and female going over, you'd want to be low for 4:30s, something like that neck of the woods. You probably want to be sub 17:30. That's someone that's going to go over and immediately be top 10 in the cross team, probably top 7, 8. Yeah, and that's excluding the Power 4 schools as such, so you sort of your Floridas, etc., because that's just a completely different ball game. You need to be professional with those sorts of schools. But with University of North Florida, like where I went, for example, LaSalle, what I would kind of categorize as like D1B, kind of mid-majors as such. Those sorts of times are going to be relatively straightforward to get your foot in.
So effectively, you need to be smart and good at cross.
Exactly.
It's the easiest way in.
Right? Yeah. Or a banger in the 800, to not need to run cross.
How do they value cross performances in the UK then? You kept mentioning it counties, which I feel like in 2014 was a much bigger deal, but perhaps that's unfair of me to say. So what do they now look at?
It depends a lot on the coach. So the reason why I was quite fortunate with Darren Gorson, he's Scottish.
Yeah.
So he kind of gets the UK cross scene. The challenge with the vast majority of America is a lack of understanding in terms of, to be honest, how good we are. I actually think sometimes a little bit in the UK, we're a little bit disrespected. You look at Birmingham, that's a group which, in my opinion, would probably be top 4 or 5 at NCAA. So there's a lack of, I wouldn't say respect, a lack of understanding in terms of the quality of the European/UK cross season. It's very difficult to use like an English school's performance, for example, for an undergrad kid, or the UK sort of intercounty series as such. Nationals is difficult. It's not what they would classify as objective enough to invest money, and they're still quite times driven, even in the US across. One of the things I can never quite get my head around, we'd race 8K cross, and they, after the race, you'd maybe mix with other teams that were there. They'd be comparing times from other meets earlier in the season. Like, we never do that. It's just, where did you place? So it's flatter, it's drier. The courses are kind of designed to be more equal to one another, especially in the high school system. So it's easier to recruit kids coming out of it. So, for cross athletes, what I'd normally advise, or at least athletes that are very good aerobically, go run a 5K road race. I've got more offers for kids that have been racing well at podium than I have running good cross.
Wow.
And to be honest, you can almost argue that podium's probably more similar to US cross in terms of it being flat, dry. The kind of nature of how you race them is a different type of experience, to be honest, American cross. So, yeah, it's differences in terms of they want to feel very secured objectively that the athlete, they know what they're getting. 5K time's going to do a better job for that than cross, ridiculously.
It's a great advert for podium for us as well, mate. So thank you for that. Hey, I want to touch on the filtering process, because we were talking a little bit off there about not just the filtering process, finding a school for the athlete, but also your filtering process, the way Olympic Sports Scholarship works, because you've had to get a little bit stricter with this as the years have gone by.
Without question. So we need to apply the same filter that a coach is going to apply, because otherwise you're not going to get there. Or at least the clients we represent are not going to get good opportunities. So we need to have the same rubric that coaches would apply to a young kid or graduate student. And the other thing is, which is also particularly important, we can't afford to bite the hand that feeds us. So if we're supplying talent that we've oversold or hasn't performed when they've got to the US, that damages that relationship, and it's less likely they come back. So, if I look at some schools where we've got 6-7 lads or 6-7 athletes, or, a pretty strong women's team, we've been able to build that because of trust. Had athletes that have gone there before that have done well. They've done as we said they would. They've progressed aggressively. And if I look at, for example, like Gwen O'Good, who went to my old program in the South, she came in as a 20K girl. She's ran 9:18 her second year. She's going to be an animal in a couple of years. But that was off of a good assessment of, okay, this kid has run a lot of soccer. She ran a 10:23K off of basically no training whatsoever. There's clearly upside. We don't know exactly how much, but there's clearly some room here for improvement. So the coach was kind of willing to have some confidence in us. With that, it's come and it's paid dividends. So we need to be pretty strict. I'd say that the 3 things I'm normally looking for: you've got to be a good student. You need to make sure that you're doing well enough in school, or at least if that element is a little bit lacking, you need to be phenomenally good athletically to kind of counter the challenges from a scholarship end. You need to be a good kid, likable, personable. You need to get along with people. You need to interview well. If you're a coach and you're working with someone for 4 or 5 years, you want to get along with them. And to be honest, even for me, right, it's much more pleasurable to work with good people, quite frankly. So you want to be personable. And I'd say the third thing as well is you need to come at this from the right angle. So it's not a case of trying to chase the finances. You're trying to advance yourself as an athlete, and you want to go to the right coach, and more of an emphasis on the quality that you're trying to lock in, rather than, I want to go to the beach for 4 years and swan around. That type of stuff is normally a bit of a red flag for us. So yeah, I think if you're a good kid, you're doing well, you're looking at it from the right perspective, we'll work with you, right? But we need to have that aggressive filtering process, because it's not going to do us any favors if we have athletes that go over that don't perform as we expect. It's only going to be bad long term for everyone.
And with that process as well, obviously there's, like anything, there's a cost associated with it. I don't know if you can disclose like what that is for athletes. Is it like a percentage of like what you get them, like it would be with an agent, or is it kind of like a flat fee type thing?
Flat fee. It's actually really interesting, because I'm registered with the NCAA. You can't charge, as an agency, you cannot charge a percentage. I wish we could, so I'd be making an absolute fortune, but we can't. So, and actually, there's a good example. There's a company called AGM, a Spanish company that was doing that for quite a few years. They had a crop of 250 athletes that went to the US. They were charging a percentage model. The NCAA found out, and they blanket banned every kid that went that year, completely null and voided their eligibility. So I know there's companies in the UK that do that. And of course, it would be lucrative, because if you're charging, say, for example, 2%, doesn't sound like much. But if you're on 60 grand a year for 4 years, that's kind of the average for a full scholarship at a lot of these schools, that ends up being better than what I charge, because I do between just under $1,000 to 2,600 for the UK market. So based on the different fees, would entail a different level of services that's provided. So yeah, I mean, look, it's difficult not to look at it and think, Jesus, that would be better financially, but I'd rather make sure we're doing things to the book. And maybe you make less in the year or two, but I kind of viewed this as a 10-year plan. We'll try and maintain a pretty strong hold within the track and field market, doing a good job, and do this for a decade rather than kind of crack my wallet. Because even the company I worked for before, they're falling off a little bit, because I think if you try and work at volume, like with anything in life, quite frankly, if you oversell, you work with too many people and you've got a bottleneck problem, you damage your brand. So you got to do things the right way. I think that's the same like with anything.
You're right. And an area which you have done quite well and you're relatively unique, and it's probably one of your assets, your strengths, is your network and your relationship with those schools, with those coaches. NCAA coaches often get accused of overworking athletes, lacking that long-term plan. So how have you kind of filtered out your own relationship with these schools as well?
Well, they've earned their their reputation fairly. I mean, there's without question a sizable number of coaches, and you can tell they're not in it for the right reason, 100%. So, and you could maybe argue kind of maybe even sometimes the same in the UK. I think the challenge with the US is I find this from individual to individual. It's either it's phenomenal, maybe they've had a friend that's gone that's had a great experience, or they've had a friend that's gone that's maybe not done quite as well as they wanted to. So it's kind of always the extreme. I tend to find this the conversation. The truth's in the middle. So I think the one thing that we try to do a particularly good job on from a network perspective is you got to understand who you're working with. So what is this coach's motivations? What's their plan? What do they get out of this? What's their security? How long are they likely to be within that program for? If you understand the individual, you understand what the motivations are, I think you're in a much better position to then understand, okay, this is something we should work with or not? And if we do work with them, who's going to be the right type of kid to go there? Because there's obviously nuances in terms of what the athlete needs. So if I gave a really simple example, the reason why I think it was always obvious that George was going to do well with VTech is George is a guy that doesn't thrive off of just stupidly high volume. He needs someone who's relatively direct to him, like, you're doing this, lad, get on with it. He responds quite well to that. And he's probably going to be a 15 guy in the long run, but he also works reasonably well with decent cross training and kind of having that level of input. And he thrives from having strong characters around him. You look at Ben Thomas for VTech, you can't really argue with the whole idea of training with, legit Olympians to try and get to that level. Now, if it was, for example, like a 10K guy, I would probably say, okay, maybe we look elsewhere. Maybe they're set up somewhere else where the training partners, the kind of precedence of the coach and how they've operated before might be a better fit, and vice versa. So I think putting it simply, you got to know the programs you're dealing with. And then, there's going to be a list of schools where I would never work with, to be honest, just from rumor and kind of obvious issues. I think one thing which is for sure true in the NCAA, I would love, and I think it's a requirement, that they improve doping protocols. I think we kind of sometimes forget how much money is in that system.
That's fair.
You want people working with the right people, and that's agents, people around them. It needs to be the right setup. So yeah, I think America's no different in that regard. They've got phenomenal people, there's bad people, you need to work with the right one.
Just on some of the schools, and with that, you mentioned, I guess, your power schools, if you like, as well, where you essentially have to be an elite. So talk about some of the issues with trying to go to those, and with that as well, I guess also if you want to go to, say, an Ivy League program, how can you embed athletic scholarships with the academic demands that they have as well, if it's possible, basically?
Yeah. So Power 4 schools, it's ruthless. It's brutal. You don't run well your first semester, you're gone. And you can have a pretty secured contract. They're still going to find ways to show that you've breached a code of conduct, whatever it is. So I think with those schools, some of them at least anyway, you're never what I would say truly locked in for 4 years. It's dependent on performance year to year. That's not to say there's not value in some of them. So for example, if you look at where Matt McKennan's going up to Penn State, he's a guy that really does well off of particularly low volume. He's not going to enjoy cross. It's not something that he's ever going to do. It just doesn't give him any benefit. And Ryan at Penn State, switched on guy. He's done a great job. He's got a lad there that's just ran a low 146 indoors. And he is an international guy, Australian, ran well in the mile when he was in the NCAA himself. His wife works in the program. So I think you need to make sure, because the challenge with the Power 4 programs, you're requiring your assistant coach, because it's very likely that you're getting trained by someone who's not the main boss. You want to make sure they're a strong enough character to kind of secure you for that 4 years and not being in a position where potentially the director kind of screws you over, right? Because also for those coaches, they want to make sure that the budget allocation they're getting is kind of consistent year to year. So I think you find variance there in terms of how much control a assistant coach has in terms of training. And I'd say, for example, an 800-meter guy, you're going to get a little bit more bang for your buck at a Penn State. You maybe look at, for example, Texas A&M, because you've got Paul Areng there, Olympic champion in his own right in 1988 in Seoul, powerful character. He's going to get his way. You're kind of more dependent within those Power 4 schools in terms of just making sure that the coach is locked in, secured, and is going to back you all day long. Because the nature of those programs is it's just success is everything. Winning is everything. They'll do whatever they need to get to that stage. Ivy Leagues, that's an entirely different ballgame. You get a sponsored admission spot. So how that works in that situation is you need to be the right academic profile. You need to have really a 4.0 or at least very close to. You still need to be good athletically. They give sponsored admission spots. So how it works is if you are good enough athletically and you have the right academic profile, they can kind of fast track you for admissions. It's always going to cost money because it's a needs-based scholarship assessment. So it's more about your parental income or your family's income rather than, are you particularly good academically, athletically, and here's the package that would reflect your quality. So it's always a slightly different number. What would I advise for students trying to pursue both? If you are elites, make sure you're talking to the right Power 4 programs for you. So for your event area, are you actually going to get quality training partners around you? Are you going to get dragged in and become a generic athlete? So for example, if you're an 800-meter guy, are they going to need you to run cross? Are they need you to go and do a 4x4, DMR, racing 3 times in one weekend? Are they going to get their pound of flesh out of you? You need to answer those fundamentals in terms of, is it going to be the right step in your career? And I'd say for students that are going to the Ivy League, if you're good enough academically, crack on. It's going to cost a bit of money, but there's also going to be an element where you probably need to accept it's going to be quite a bit of work. That the studies is going to be significant. The training is still arguably pro, in terms of how they kind of train and the structure of competitions, etc. So it takes a bit of time. If you look at, for example, James Dargan that went to Stanford, lovely lad. I had a chat with him in Boston when he was competing up there. It just took him a semester to kind of get adjusted to the demands that type of school kind of places on athletes. And he's adjusted and he's running well now. But it took time. So I think you need to be aware that will be an inevitability of attending those sorts of programs.
Mate, I think this would be helpful for the listeners. Can you just break down what a Power 4 school is?
Yeah, so I'd say the easiest way of looking at it, the big boys. So the major conferences, the big football conferences in basketball. So your SEC, Big Ten, and they will look so different after this summer. They're going to have roster limits of 25, 35. So that, your kind of classic big programs, your Uni of Floridas, Oklahoma States, Alabamas, etc. I would say any kind of big major state school that is absolutely raking it in with American football and basketball money, that would be what I would classify as a powerful program. Now that would probably change. I wouldn't be surprised if they go off and almost set up their own governing body, or they go and merge some conferences together. But I'd always say, I think classically they're going to be referred to as the Power 4, no matter what happens in that regards.
Okay, cool. And, talk about some of the changes, because there is a lot, and you've got some great ideas about potentially where what the landscape might look like in the next sort of 4 or 5 years. But I think something which is becoming more and more frequent in the NCAA is those sort of 25-year-old, not even post-grad, people who are kind of beyond post-grad realm, who are now obviously competing in the NCAA more and more, which makes it very difficult to justify an 18-year-old coming in when you can go get a 25-year-old.
It's going to change a lot. So I think to probably explain the changes, it's useful to explain why they're even happening in the first place. So the lawsuit last summer was basically a load of American football and basketball players that sued the NCAA for antitrust lawsuit violations regarding their name and image likeness. So these athletes got together and went, hold up, and to be honest, I don't disagree with them. The NCAA sold the image rights back in the 2000s for a basketball game and made billions, sold it to EA Sports. So, they've been making billions of dollars every year from college sports. So the argument was, well, hold up, you've limited our ability to make money fairly. You've not allowed us to go sign professional contracts or sell our image rights. Our own image rights, you've not allowed us to profit from those. We're going to sue you. And the NCAA was like, okay, good luck with that. And they lost. And they got to pay back $2.7 billion over the next 10 years in back damages. So the first change is just, it's a completely different landscape now because obviously you're paying back a lot of money that's leaving the system to previous generations of athletes. And now you have to pay the elite athletes that are already within your programs, or you at least need to facilitate ways in which they can make money to realistically stay. Because if one program can go and offer you 150 grand, you're going to leave the program that's offering you nothing or only 50. So the first change is just the nature of income. Now there's no real cap. You can kind of go beyond the 100% scholarship, but that money needs to come from somewhere. So I would say that there's a pooling of wealth at the top end for the elite athletes. They're making more than they ever have done. And the money's kind of moving away from the athletes lower down the system. So the line in the sand of the haves and the have-nots is a bit more extreme. The other change is just eligibility rules. So because the NCAA, they're 110 for 0 with lawsuits. They've lost every lawsuit they've ever been in. So they've just gone, sod this, we're getting completely, knackered every time. They've just deregulated. So the reason why you see so many African lads and girls that go is what they don't want to do is get into a situation when they go, okay, we're not going to let you come in because you're too old, or we're not going to let you come in because X, Y, Z. And obviously their fear is, okay, we're just opening ourselves up for another lawsuit in the future and we can get, again, screwed. So that's where you find these kind of changes with waivers and eligibility criteria. That's more subjective. So what you're seeing is schools where they have a physical NCAA, it's called a compliance officer, who's based in that program. They'll go, okay, well, my kind of, review of the rules, in my opinion, you get 2 years. So there's huge differences. So some schools, they'll get a 27-year-old guy or girl, couple years of eligibility out of nowhere, even though they're way beyond the 5-year clock rule, because they can stack poverty waivers. If you try to qualify for your national team, you can waive that season. And another one, which is kind of blunt, but if you can show that you've not ran for a certain period, just go in and delete your records, for example, or change your birth certificate, change when you graduated high school, who's going to question that? No one's going to really question that at all. So it's more subjective, it's more kind of opaque, the landscape. And I think that my expectation is the kind of the UK athletes that are coming out from a graduate perspective, they're going to get more and more years. So if I use like Ryan Elston, there's a good example of this, who signed with Butler. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is, okay, how can we get in that second year? He should really only get the first year. Like if we're going to look at it from the old rules perspective, it would just be, you got 1 year, job done. But, we can put down that he was trying to qualify for an international team. He'll get that second year quite easily. So I think UK athletes that are going in the future will just get more years of eligibility. And I wouldn't be surprised if they just completely remove the 5-year clock altogether. It's just, okay, a bit like Bucks, you can compete for as long as you're studying for. And whenever you leave is when you leave. But it is bizarre, right? And I'm not a massive fan of, like, if you're an 18-year-old kid, I don't really want you going to programs where there's legitimate 30-year-old men in the team. It's a different dynamic and culture. And that's for sure the case. Only last week, a school in Texas signed a 29-year-old. He'll be graduating at 34. That's weird in my opinion.
Wait. He's actually got 5 years of eligibility then?
Yeah, 29. We'll finish at 34 years old. Mate, go get a family. That would be my advice at that point, But yeah, he'll be on decent money. So I'm not gonna blame him for it. But
I think this is one of the big things, isn't it? The money is not just there from scholarships, but these nil deals are obviously massive. Do different schools, I mean, you especially these Power 4 schools that we've been talking about, do they have links with brands? Like we are starting to see coaches, work with athletes of a particular brand, a particular school, and you go, okay, well, they've just joined this school's sponsored by Nike. Chances are they're going to get a nil deal with Nike.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the big things that coaches are fighting for is if they can get linked in with a brand, their finances are secured. So, for example, Providence with New Balance, the reason why they've been able to bring in so many good female athletes is because New Balance are backing them pretty heavily. So if you're a coach and you can associate with a brand, you're in a significantly advanced position over another program who maybe isn't going to have the same capability from an NIL perspective. It's interesting actually as well, because when I was in Boston, it is true for sure. Brands aren't stupid. They're also going to be much more interested in aligning with coaches who have done a good job in the past, because it's more likely that athlete's going to graduate and obviously be, very capable from when they're 22 to whatever age. You kind of see that a little bit with like the swoosh club, obviously sort of going towards NAU, etc. Baylor, or with BYU, sorry. So, there's going to be more of that happening. And it's a win-win, quite frankly, for everyone involved. But it will, again, lead to some schools just having just stupid money. So I'll give you a good example. Oregon, they have Ducks of a Feather, which is like kind of a company they've set up, which is paid in with Nike cash. Some of the kids there are making like just stupid money. Like it's like, you don't need to leave. You're done. Like, for example, the lad, the 142 guy.
Yep.
We're talking well beyond six figures, well beyond. So they have the provisions in place to kind of capitalize on this. The challenge is that not every state has adopted the NIL regulations. 31 of the 50 so far. So some schools are like, fuck, we need to kind of get on with this because we're just losing out on talent. But if you can align with a brand, if you can kind of set up like a little kind of independent company that kind of handles the NIL stuff as well on behalf of the university, you can kind of, again, get free pots of money for some of these athletes that are entering the system. So yeah, six figures will become common, I think, for those elite athletes. That's become a common thing.
You're having legitimate conversations, or you will be, with athletes who are not only now looking to go to the NCAA, but it's like, hey, we're now talking about your livelihood as well. We're not just talking about a degree and getting to a decent level of running. We're now talking about how much can you make off of this sport, because although nil deals exist, the bar is still much lower than a professional contract. Would you agree with that? Or would you say to get a nil deal, you probably have to be the level that you would be to get a professional contract?
You probably need to be someone that's deemed as being the level in a couple of years at the very minimum. So, if we take Matt McKenna, for example, he's a lad who's ran 146.8, but he's 17. So there's value in youth. So I think it's two things. Is either you're the finished product already, you are running phenomenally well for your age, so there's an investment in youth, or, to be honest, you have a massive brand. So if we use examples in the US, right, because there's a guy that I'm very, very fond of, a guy called Isaiah, that's worked with like Cooper Tier and all sorts of athletes in the US. His kids who have 20,000+ followers get 50 grand more than the kids that don't. So it's how good's your branding? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've been actively trying to work on with the kids that we've got that we think have probably got the potential to go on and be pretty elite, like, got to get your socials going, because it's easy money, quite frankly. You factor that into how much your value is. So, good branding, good social media profile, obviously performing very well, which makes up about 60% of that compensation, and then your youth. But the money, part of me thinks it's like cryptocurrency, to be honest. It's new. I think some examples has just been rampant overpaying. Truly, I just think the numbers.
Well, I look at it now and I'm like, I know brands have first refusal on that athlete. But beyond that, are they getting that money back? Like, they must be if they're investing it. But, you still see examples where athletes have a nil deal with one brand, but yet the school's sponsored by a different brand and they're wearing different shoes to what their nil deal is. I'm just like, they're hardly posting. And I'm just like, what? Bar that first refusal when they turn pro, if they turn pro, what more are you getting? But
yeah, I think sometimes brands have made massive mistakes, because one of the challenges from a tax perspective, you can't work when you're in the US. So if you've signed with a brand, you can't post when you're in America. You either need to do it you need to post when you're back in your domestic country, or you need to have a marketing company that you pay to post on your behalf. The moment you work in the US, you null and void your visa as a student, F1 visa. You cannot work. You can't do any form of work in the US. So I think some of these deals as well, and I know this from talking to agents, brands have jumped and been a little bit aggressive bringing someone on. Like, okay, they popped off, fling the bag, and then it's like, shit, okay, We've not even discussed like how we're going to get our investment back, what we've thrown up.
Yeah.
There's a lump sum. There's no performance component. So I think some brands look at it like, okay, this is good because if this athlete does something crazy, runs something incredible, we're not having to pay them more. But in the end, you kind of need to anyway, because if you're not paying them more, by the time they graduate, they're just going to go to another brand that gives them that value. I think brands are kind of working this out. Like, for example, Puma and Asics. Puma dipped out after the Indian lad popped at Florida.
Yeah.
That was dreadful for them. And A6 are kind of like, do we do this? Do we not? I think you've had some early adopters. I don't necessarily blame the late adopters, to be honest. And also, a lot of the agents are like, well, the retention rate is 96%. So if you sign with us, or you sign that kid, it's very likely 96% of the time that they're going to sign with your brand when you graduate. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the examples, Parker Balby, she would have been getting an absolute fortune from Nike, and she just swans off to New Balance. So, I think if you're going to do it from an NIL perspective, probably now is when they're overpaying. I would imagine that the market kind of settles a little bit in a couple of years, at least when the statistics are a little bit more known. But it's bizarre, and I won't disclose his numbers, but like Ryan Elston, not from a NIL perspective, but a cost of attendance scholarship, like you'd be surprised. I was surprised. It's like, Jesus, I must be better at my job than I thought. But it's if you're running well, like it's not bad financially, better than I ever thought it would become, to be honest.
And this is the thing, I don't think anyone could have forecast what is currently going on. At what point does the NCAA just surpass the elite world? Because you mentioned sports like American football and basketball, and whilst obviously the NFL and the NBA are supremely popular in the US, they are considered to be bigger in college. But at what point does running get to that point where we just don't bother running on the pro circuit at all?
Yeah, I think it depends on the market you come from or the country that you come from. I think that, for example, the Kenyan athletes, how likely are you to qualify for an Olympic team is so low. If you look at the sheer volume of guys and girls they've got that are just ridiculously good. So I think for them, if the rules ever changed from an eligibility window perspective, can't imagine they would ever leave. At least if you're not absolutely certain in terms of having a realistic opportunity for qualifying for a major championship. From a UK perspective, it'd be an interesting one. The issue of the US, or not the issue, the reason why it is as financially lucrative as it is, eyeballs. You're dealing with a market which is 6 times the number of people. They are genuinely more interested in track and field. When we went to Boston a couple of weeks ago, that's the environment, the atmosphere, the number of people coming. You're paying $75 for an entrance. The tickets are $20. You watch it on Flow Track. The income is pretty decent. It's obviously nowhere near eclipsing in any way, shape or form close to what football and basketball is bringing in. But there is money that's generated in track and field, and it's a lot larger than our markets. We'll see. I think the challenge is, and this is where I think there might be a little bit of a reset in the future. Americans don't massively like this because they're obviously looking and thinking, well, hold up, we're high schoolers that train, work hard. We're getting completely pushed out by foreign talent who are older. That's not very fair. So I think there might be an element where it becomes almost damaging for the college sports system. I mean, you see it in American football. There's been some unpopularity with Australian kickers coming over, and they've been trying to find a way in which they can try and reduce that a little bit because, again, they don't like the taste it leaves in their mouth of, we're taking away American spots, which I kind of sympathize. I kind of get that. So I think it will get a lot more crazy, and then it might just reset a little bit as Americans maybe lose interest in seeing their, young talent getting completely killed by, a 25-year-old Kenyan dude that can run a 13:10. It is not that attractive to watch maybe if you're an American, which I get.
Yeah, this podcast has been a great justification of me and Lum were only just talking about, qualifying to the NCAA indoors, top 16 in the NCAA for the 3K is something like 850 for the women and 741 or something stupid for the men. But I think you have broken it down very clearly why those marks are so high. It is the NCAA does not look like, and we know it doesn't, but I think it's quite eye-opening. It's so different to even fight, pre-COVID, completely different. So I think that's interesting. And on that, obviously Division 1 is just changing so drastically. Pre this podcast, we had a little conversation about why Division 2 might just turn into the old format of Division 1. So how is what's going on in Division 1 impacting Division 2 and even Division 3, because again, it's quite a viable, there's lots of viable schools for kids to go to there as well.
For sure, mate. If you look at Division 2 a decade ago, there was nowhere near the depth of talent. It was, I think people rightly had the perspective that Division 2 wasn't going to give them any king in terms of investment, in terms of upside. It was a different division altogether. Roster limits within Division 1, so there's going to be a huge number of athletes that fall out of those big schools. If you look at, for example, use Houston, they've got 80 plus kids, they've got roster limits of 45, they need to remove half their team this summer. So the transfer portal is going to be nuts in a couple of weeks, there's no question. So where do they go? Okay, well, you might fall into mid-majors, but they also have roster limits as well. So a lot of those athletes will fall out and go D2. I mean, you see it even like, for example, Jack Gum, 338 guy going to Adams State. Financially, they're in a very strong position at altitude. So I think you'll find there'll be, the depth will improve, but I think also you'll find at the top end, those Division 2 schools will just capitalise on being able to build bigger teams and not have caps that they have to work within. Division 2 will unquestionably become a lot stronger. And the eligibility rules are a little bit more lax as well. So I wouldn't even be surprised if you find some serious bangers that go D2 from Europe as well. I mean, the French lad at Adams State, the lad that ran 13:02 in Boston, he's I believe with New Balance, he's not going to leave. I mean, why would you? You're quite happy with what you've got at the moment. The training's working. He just ran 7:23, I think, was it, in the 3K or whatever it was he ran. Can't remember. 7:36, sorry. You're doing all right. So yeah, I think Division 2 is going to become a lot more attractive for, I would say, like a kind of 150 flat type kind of 800 meter kid, maybe into 153. On the women's side, maybe kind of 209 to sort of 212, like that type of athlete. D2 will financially be better, probably experience wise might even be better as well.
I was going to say, what type of personality, or does it not matter, might thrive a little bit more in a D2 school?
Bit of a chip on their shoulder, to be honest.
Yeah.
Less, what's the word? The right type of character. You got to be a bit more blue collar. I think the challenge with a lot of kids, obviously, they think, okay, I want to go to the biggest school possible. If I can't go there, I don't want to go at all. That's the perspective for a lot of kids. I think if you're like, you know what, I want to go to the right coach, grind it, work hard. George went D2.
Before
for him. And right coach, right setup. His eligibility was something that we needed to fix that first year in terms of GPA. He fixed it and he's gone into the right program. So I think if you're of the view that you want to go, give it a rip, work with the right people and see what happens. I've got another lad at Charleston from where George attended, Sam Midians. He came in as a 9 flat 3K guy. He's just ran 148, second year, 800, 1410, 5K. So he's a perfect example of just a hustler. Like just a hardworking, genuine kid who's like, you know what? Like, put me in the right program, Nathan, and I'll give it a rip and I'll see what I can do. So, you got to be that type of character where I think you're just willing to grind it out and work hard and not be bothered about the name that you're going to. And that kid, he can go where he wants. If he wants to go somewhere, he can go there. He's laid such a strong foundation in terms of the range of his performances that it's completely his choice what he does next. He might stay, maybe he leaves. I think he'll probably stay, but again, show you, that's a kid that actually is not even thinking of leaving because of the value that he's getting from the school that he's attending.
I think you've just brought something up that I think is worth touching on as well. Just the impact on your, I guess, education when you transfer as well. Obviously, financially it makes sense. Athletically, it probably makes sense. To something like George has done, went to a D2 school and now he's at Virginia Tech. But how does that impact the athlete and I guess the degree they're studying for?
Well, I transferred. It's actually really, transferring is difficult. It's easy if you know what you're doing. I guess you can say that with anything in life. From an education perspective, you need to have kind of the same as when you first go over. You need to have a high enough GPA. The higher your GPA, the more modules that will be accepted when you convert your degree or when you transfer it to a new program. So say if you're, I don't know, a business major, you're 2 years here and you've done well, you've got a particularly good pass mark in each of your modules. When you switch into a new school, what they'll normally do is they'll go, okay, this module we have, you've done this module, yep, cool, tick it off. And then they'll tick off, normally I'd say 85% of the modules that you've completed. And then you just proceed from where you've left, basically. So America's kind of set up to be quite transfer happy because you have a lot of kids that go into the junior college system that do their 2-year associate's degree and then switch in and complete that at a 4-year school. So transferring is not really a alien concept for them. I mean, it's actually probably more common at this point than not. I think the transfer statistics from I think it was 24, you had just over 40% of athletes that went to the US transferred at some point in their tenure. So nearly half. And that will go up. It's not really something we do, obviously, typically in the UK. You very rarely find someone transferring universities from, I don't know, Birmingham to Loughborough or whatever. So it's kind of set up to be more favorable. It's also universities they're businesses, they're very profit driven. So if you're having a kid come over to your uni and they're paying tuition fees, win-win. You want to make that process quite appealing, because some of those schools will charge 30, 40, 50, 60 grand just for classes. So the more you have, the more money you make. So yeah, transferring is normally pretty straightforward. It's just having a good enough GPA.
And I guess just important probably time to say this, that for those people listening, what type of person do you want to approach you now? Because ideally, right, there's a load of people listening that are like, okay, that sounds like a great deal. I'd love to go out to the US, but what type of person is it you're looking for, and like, what should they do really?
Yeah, so I've kind of got my own personal sort of red flags, I guess you could say, from experience. I'm always a little bit nervous with athletes that want to go and live it up on the beach, or maybe they ask me, for example, about the party life. It's like, okay, yeah, we probably need to try and come at this from the right angle, lads. So I think there's elements where I just need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, and you're looking at this from a strict, I want to do well for myself academically, and I want to get out of this the absolute maximum athletically. So you need to have the fundamentals in place. You got to be brave, no question. I was homesick as hell my first semester. It was a huge adjustment as a young kid going over. So but you have to be pretty brave. There's a lot of challenges that naturally come over the course of 4 or 5 years. You need to be resilient. I think you need to be an athlete that's willing to accept challenge, for sure. And you need to be someone that's relatively comfortable under pressure, because even if there's not pressure, I think sometimes you almost place them on yourself. You try and justify the scholarship you're on. I mean, that was a mistake I made, for sure, at certain periods during my 5 years. It's like, okay, I'm on a full, I've got a number on my back. I kind of need to justify being on this money. And then you're just kind of forcing it a little bit. So, I think if you're the right type of personality, I think you're willing to kind of accept those things, and you're very motivated intrinsically. I think America's a good place to be, at the right school with the right people. I think it's a good place to be. I'd say those are normally the things that we're trying to identify in the athletes we're representing.
Perfect. Well, look, that's a great place to end, I think. But Nathan, thanks so much for coming on, and hopefully you can get a few more of our UK guys and girls out there as well.
Cheers, guys.